All right, great. So welcome to the PLOS Climate Editorial Board and also to this new academic editor welcome webinar. This is our agenda for the day. We're going to start off with a welcome and introductions to those of us that are running this webinar. We will go through the academic editor role, and in particular, pointing out where you might be able to access, where you will be able to access resources later on. So regardless of whether you've been on the board for some time, or maybe you're just joining us, it's likely that everything that you see today won't be incredibly relevant to what you're doing right now. So we have links to the various guides that you will need at various key stages of your academic editor journey, if you will. We'll open the floor for some question and answer. So we'll facilitate that through the chat, or if you feel comfortable asking your question out loud, that's wonderful. If you do have questions along the presentation, we just ask that you please do save that for the question and answer session. Or if you'd like, you can pop it in the chat, and there's a couple of us from PLOS that might be able to answer it. And if not, we'll get to it during that session. Then we'll have a brief summary and closing, and then we will go into breakout rooms and give you a chance to get to know each other, since we are a pretty distributed organization at this point. You can hear people calling in from all across the world. So very exciting, and luckily Zoom can facilitate something like that. So moving right along, starting with introductions. I'm going to introduce myself first. I'm Dina Emerson. I'm the Editorial Board Experience Manager on the Editorial Board Services team. And we're a team here at PLOS that is across our whole organization and all of the different journals that we have. And we have anything and everything that has to do with editorial boards, from recruitment to handling resignations and communications, et cetera, running these webinars, for example. Yeah, so I'm going to pass it over to Jamie and let him introduce himself.
Thanks, Dina. So hi, everyone. I'm Jamie. I'm the executive editor for PLOS Climate. I will have interacted with many of you already by email or perhaps even by Zoom. So I am the PLOS editorial lead for the journal. Prior to joining PLOS Climate, I spent 3 years or so working on PLOS One. My background is in plant ecology and the impact of climate change on the physiological characteristics of plants growing in tropical rainforests. So that's my kind of background and interest in climate science. And I will hand over to Laura on the call.
Yeah, hi everybody. I'm Laura. I'm part of the Editorial Board Services team with Dina, and you may have seen emails from me. I've been helping with the recruitment and trying to get a great new editorial board in shape for the new PLOS Climate Journal. And then handing over to Emma.
Hi everyone, I'm Emma. I'm the editor-in-chief. I'm a geographer at the University of Pretoria in South Africa. At the moment, I'm actually dialing in from Cape Town, from my childhood home. So it's a treat. Beautiful day in Cape Town, absolutely stunning. Bit of a cold front coming over later in the week. And it's just great to have an opportunity to meet all of you. Thank you so much for agreeing to work with us and to join us.
All right, and because we have quite a few academic editors on board, I'm going to start sharing a poll here where we have some questions to see who might be calling in from today. So here we go. If you can just fill out those questions, I'll give you about 30 seconds to fill them out. All right, here we go. We've got a pretty good spread of people. Looks like everyone's pretty far along in their career. Interesting to see. And most people serving on 1 to 3 editorial boards. Also interesting to see. This last question of where are you calling in from? I always kind of secretly hope someone's over in Antarctica calling in, but haven't gotten one yet. Anyway, welcome. All right, moving right along on our agenda here. I'm actually going to pass this over to Jamie and Emma to give a little introduction to the journal that we're all part of here.
Thanks very much, Dina. So I'll kick off, and then Emma, if you want to add to anything that I've said, then please do. Thank you again, everyone, for joining the call today and for participating in our journal community. It's fantastic to have you all involved. And I thought it might be useful if I just provided a little bit of context for where the journal has come from and how it fits into PLOS's portfolio, and to touch also on our mission, our scope. And I also just wanted to highlight to you something about the financial model that the journal is running on, which you may or may not be familiar with already, but which is really closely tied in with what we're trying to achieve as a journal. So in terms of where the concept for PLOS Climate originated, really it was part of a drive from PLOS with the launch of a suite of new journals to place a focus on the communities that we serve. And with the ethos of diversity and equity in mind, really trying to bring together researchers from across the world, from across disciplines and different sorts of societal stakeholders to participate in PLOS Climate as a venue, for a really dynamic venue for research touching on all aspects of climate science. So we want to act as, if you like, a hub for a community to sort of gravitate around. And in doing so, we hope to act as a real vehicle for positive change, supporting solutions-oriented research, which is obviously aimed at addressing one of the major challenges facing humanity in the 21st century in terms of climate change. And so part of the journal's mission is really trying to foster a degree of global inclusivity, acting as a platform for researchers and voices from underrepresented regions, both in terms of our published output, but also in terms of what we can do with our blog platform and social media to contribute to that. We're, of course, a very multidisciplinary journal, representing many communities across the breadth of climate science and related areas of research. And so we want to try to break down some of the barriers which have existed between the sort of traditional disciplinary silos, and to encourage connections to be forged between those communities, which historically have perhaps sort of operated in parallel. We want to act as a conduit by which they can kind of interact with each other, and we hope to encourage increasing amounts of interdisciplinary work across climate science. Of course, being a PLOS journal, we're also particularly interested in not just open access, but open science more generally. And we want to do what we can to identify and overcome cultural or technical barriers to the adoption of open science practices. And so over the course of our journey together, you'll be hearing lots more about what we're doing as a journal to try to advocate for open science and provide useful solutions for researchers to move towards fully open practices. We also want to make sure that we connect researchers and decision makers and other relevant audiences for the work that we publish. We want to make sure that the scientific articles that the journal is putting out into the public domain are reaching the people who really need to know about that science. And so again, we're going to be doing a lot of work to try to make those links in a meaningful and productive way. And finally, I also wanted to mention our particular interest in supporting early career researchers who are going to be the climate science leaders of tomorrow. And actually, I've already been having, on behalf of the journal, some really fruitful initial discussions with some early career researcher networks around the world, trying to establish opportunities for collaborative activities and projects where we can work with them to further the interest, not just of the journal, but also of some of the people who are working at the coalface in the early stages of their careers. And so finally, I just wanted, as I said, to mention something about the global equity model, the funding model that the journal is operating on. It's a new model for PLOS. It's being run on several of the new PLOS journals. It's been specifically designed to try to foster increased global participation in open access publishing, recognizing some of the limitations of traditional open access models. And the way that it works is that institutional participation fees based on an institution's historical research output in the field and their geographical location in the world, that's the basis for the deal. So it's done at the institution level rather than the article level. And when an institution buys into one of these deals with PLOS, any researchers who are affiliated to that institution will be able to publish their work free of charge in any of the participating PLOS journals for the duration of that deal's operative period. And so the per article cost to the institution will be potentially very low compared to the APC approach that we have previously been operating on. And the other nice aspect to this model is that any institutional partners can help to make open access publishing even more accessible to researchers from lower income countries in particular, by providing an optional additional contribution into their deal. And any funds from those voluntary payments will be pooled together to further subsidize the pricing options for institutions based in lower and low to middle income countries the following year. So there's this kind of sense of institutions in higher income countries being able to support participation from those based in lower income countries in what we hope will be a really sort of collaborative way. So we think it's a really kind of positive step in terms of the direction that open access models are moving in. And if you want to learn more about it, then I'd encourage you to check out the information that's available on our web pages. There's plenty there to read about. And if you have any questions, please do get in touch with us to ask. Now, I think that's everything I had to say, but if Emma would like to add to anything that I've mentioned, then please chime in.
Yeah, just to mention that we've had actually an amazing journey so far in building the team, and we've also been liaising with some of our section editors. And what's very striking to me is that some of the section editors have come on board, as perhaps some of you have, with a strong sense of wanting to engage with open science, and also with a sense of this kind of wish to perhaps really change the nature of the community that are publishing in climate just a little bit, to evolve it onwards. And so I think something I've really realized is that that's something that all of us are pretty passionate about, and it's clearly a driving force in terms of why quite a lot of people choose to join the PLOS climate team. So while we're going to be talking a lot today and giving a lot of input, we're also looking forward to working with you interactively and hearing some of your ideas.
Great, thank you.
Back to Dina, yeah.
Great. All right. Progressing right along. So that's actually a really great segue from Emma in talking about the PLOS Climate Editorial Board. So again, part of this is just pointing you towards resources that you can then find later. I will mention that all of the slides in this recording will also be sent to you, so you'll be able to click on some of these links. But if you do want to see members of the editorial board, of which we were constantly growing, you can find them here on the website. And there's Emma and Jamie here. And the list of section and academic editors is here on the web. This is updated manually, so there's a little bit of a lag between when someone joins and when the website is updated. So just a little thing to note. But there you can see people's subject area expertise and who the section and academic editors are. And then a brief distinction between section and academic editors. And because we're still building and growing this journal, the role of a section editor is evolving a little bit. But traditionally, section editors have had a deeper knowledge on particular subject areas and are available to consult on tricky, if you will, manuscripts. And then, of course, academic editors is what you all are here today and what we're here to talk about in terms of the role. So very briefly, this is the role description that was sent to you at the recruitment and onboarding stage. So I'm going to go pretty quickly through this slide. But in short, an academic editor oversees the peer review process from initial evaluation all the way through to a final decision. You have a high degree of autonomy in the ability to make decisions along that peer review timeline. Including issuing decisions and deciding whether to send it out for peer review or not, all of which we'll go into a little bit later. The next thing you will have also seen is our code of conduct for editorial board members. Ethics is something that we take very seriously here at PLOS, and we expect our academic editors to also uphold the same standard. Again, you will have seen this as part of your onboarding process, but it's something you can go back to and reference at any time. All right, getting into the meat of it. So Editorial Manager is the submission system that we use for all PLOS journals. And we have this helpful guide here. So throughout this presentation, I'm going to toggle in and out of the presentation to actually show you the guides and see, so you can get a sense of what they look like and how to navigate them. So the first one is this guide to Editorial Manager. And this is just a screenshot guide of all of the things that you might possibly need to do within the submission system. And so very initially getting started and updating your information is something that's always helpful to reference. We do use email as our main mode of communication for tracking journal submissions and communicating with you. So it's very important to keep your contact information up to date, in particular that first email that's listed in Editorial Manager. So all of the screenshots for how to do that is going to be here in this Getting Started section. So if we scroll down to indicating your areas of expertise and keeping your information up to date, all of that when you first log into Editorial Manager is going to be at this top bar here. You'll see a black kind of navigation bar up at the top. And this Update My Information page will take you to just a typical profile page of what you might see on an online website. And from there, you can update your personal and contact information. And then of particular note, also, you can type in free text keywords that indicate your area of expertise. And so we'll go into in a little bit about how manuscript invitations are sent to you. But this is really helpful for PLOS staff in particular to send you invitations that are targeted to your area of expertise. So if you can go into the Update My Information page and type in some keywords that best describe your area of expertise, that's very helpful for us. Another thing that I would like to point out on the Update My Information page, all the way at the bottom, is this ability to add in unavailable dates. So this is if you are a field biologist, for example, and you're planning on doing some field work research and you will not be at your computer, you can go into Editorial Manager and add dates that will bookend your unavailability. And you also have the ability to type in a little note as to why you're going to be out. Of particular helpfulness to us is if you can indicate whether you're available to handle revisions. So after you issue an initial decision to the authors and they work on their revision and then they submit it back, it will automatically be assigned back to your account unless you indicate otherwise. So if you say, okay, I'm going to be in the unreachable jungle, I'm not going to have access to a computer, I'm unavailable to handle revisions, we'll work to get that paper assigned to a different academic editor. So if you can just type in any sort of helpful information on that one, that's good. All right, that's it for the intro to Editorial Manager for now. Now going into the life of a PLOS Climate manuscript. This is a generalized timeline for most manuscripts as they come through. The authors submit it here. Of keynote that I want to point out are these particular technical checks that you'll see along here. This is where we'll look for things like, did the authors put in all of the correct information in the correct places? Is all of the metadata present? Those kinds of just technical checking. Then we send it out for academic editor invitation. This is where it will come to you, after which you can, the word I'm looking for, you can issue, thank you. You can issue an initial decision whether to send it out for peer review or reject it without review. Then it moves along. And then here we have the submission scanning where an editor looks for things like adherence to scope, and in particular ethics concerns as well. And there's a whole suite of other checks that Jamie can speak more to a little bit later on. And then of course that follows the traditional peer review timeline. If you did choose to send it out for peer review, where you can issue particular decisions along this line. And then eventually, if the paper is accepted for publication, it'll go through one last technical check and then go into production for publication on the web. All right, so jumping into the first of our guides that will be available to you later on the resources for editors page. And this is the first moment in which you will see a manuscript invitation and you can take an initial decision of what to do when that invitation comes to your inbox. So jumping out of this presentation over to this quick guide that we have, this will walk you through the considerations that you would think about when you receive a manuscript invitation, as well as a guide to what the different pieces of a manuscript invitation look like. There are various forms of manuscript invitations depending on the history of the manuscript, or if there's something of particular note that we would like to call out to. But this is the traditional format of a manuscript invitation. You'll be able to pick them out pretty easily by the all caps PLOS. So it's pretty easy to see those email invites in your inbox. Then it'll have information about the manuscript, in particular, what is the number, what is the title, and then the author list, which is particularly helpful for you to determine if you know any of the authors, for example, in which you would not want to handle that manuscript due to a conflict of interest. You can interact with the manuscript in various ways from deep links within this email. You can both accept or decline the invitation in the email, or actually navigate to your editorial manager profile where you will be able to download the full submission. Because in this invitation, it's just the keywords and abstract that are pulled in terms of the actual content of the paper. And then moving along in this guide, we have this helpful table here of things that you would want to consider before accepting or declining a manuscript invitation. Of particular note would be to consider the amount of time that you have available. It is our expectation that if you agree to handle a manuscript, that you are able to handle it all the way through to a final decision. Of course, no competing interests with any of the authors, very important to consider. And then, of course, is it in your area of expertise? So are you able to identify suitable reviewers and provide proper guidance to the authors in terms of digesting and understanding those reviews? So that's the guide there. And then moving along, so that's that first key decision of whether you decide to take on a manuscript invitation or not. And then from there, that starts, let's say you do accept a manuscript invitation, that starts this general peer review timeline. Of course, this is a generalized timeline. Every manuscript is unique and will have different sets of circumstances, and parts of this may take longer or less time. But generally, this is the timeline that a manuscript would follow. So once you accept the manuscript invitation, you have it for about 3 days, and you consider whether to send it out for peer review or reject it prior to peer review. Let's say you do send it out for peer review, spending about 1 to 2 weeks finding and securing reviewers, and that's done through the editorial manager system. And Jamie will go into some of that guidance a little bit later on. And then giving some time for the reviewers to submit the review and for you to, as the reviews come in, once it reaches that, all of the reviews have come in and you're able to perform your evaluation of the manuscript. Now that the reviews are in, within 3 days, we ask that you make a decision, of which also Jamie will go into the different decision options a little bit later on. All right, and with that, I'm actually going to pass it on over to Jamie at this point to go through the next guides that we have.
Thanks, Dina. I will just attempt to share my screen. 1 minute. Okay, so I hope you will all now be able to see my screen, which will look remarkably similar, same presentation. So yes, as Dina said, I'm going to now talk through some of the process of actually handling a paper through peer review from the initial submission, initial evaluation stage through to issuing a decision on the manuscript, and in between thinking about inviting reviewers and assessing reviewers' comments. So to start off, we'll talk a bit about initial evaluation. So when you first accept an invitation to handle a manuscript, what are the sorts of things that you need to be thinking about when you're deciding what you're going to do with that manuscript? So the key messages here really are to consider how you're going to apply your own expertise to the assessment of the manuscript and how you're going to apply the journal's publication criteria. So in terms of applying your own subject area expertise. Of course, we recognise that you are going to be the expert. If you have accepted to handle a paper, then it will be because it's in an area that you have expertise in. And so what that means is that we would expect you to nuance your interpretation of the journal's publication criteria according to your knowledge of the norms and the standards in your field, whether that be in terms of methodological reporting or the types of information that are needed for the manuscript to be replicable, reproducible. We also ask you to think about the content of the manuscript in terms of how the authors have gone about addressing the research question, whether they've met any particular requirements there might be in terms of ethics or reporting, for instance, accession numbers for specimens which are coming from a repository, those sorts of things. And based on your own familiarity with your area of expertise, you'll be best placed to understand whether the authors need to have provided certain types of information in the manuscript along those sorts of lines. And as I mentioned, your expertise will also enable you to judge how best to apply the journal's publication criteria. And at this point, I'm going to switch over to one of these nice resources, which you'll be able to refer back to, which runs through the process of the initial assessment of the manuscript. And included in this is a quick guide to the journal's publication criteria, which hopefully you've at least seen at some point in your journey so far. Some of you may already have had the chance to apply them to a manuscript. They're of course available through our website, but they're also listed in this resource document too. I won't run through them all in detail now, but essentially the thrust of the publication criteria collectively is to ascertain the scientific rigor of the manuscript and the accessibility of the information contained in the manuscript. And so, as I say, when you're thinking about whether or not a manuscript meets these core criteria, we would ask you to consider how these apply in your field. And what types of information you need to be looking for in the manuscript to ensure that each of those criteria have been fulfilled. And I'm thinking in particular about things like this third criterion. Experiments, statistics, and other analyses have been performed to a high technical standard and are described in sufficient detail. Well, you as the expert are going to be best placed to decide what sufficient detail means in this case. And of course, if you are unsure about that, then it's always possible to consult either with a staff editor at the journal, such as myself, with another member of the editorial board or a section editor, to get a second opinion on whether or not the authors have met that criterion. In terms of the publication criteria, one thing that I wanted to mention, because it's not a publication criterion for our journal, is the idea of novelty. So if those of you who work on editorial boards at other journals may have been asked to make decisions on manuscripts based on the perceived novelty of the paper and the work contained in it. At PLOS Climate, we are not selecting papers on the basis of novelty. So as part of your assessment of the manuscript, you shouldn't be thinking about whether this is hugely impactful work or sexy or however you want to describe it. We're really focusing on the reproducibility and the rigor of the science contained in the paper. So you can put any considerations to do with novelty to one side and really stick to the reporting and the reproducibility. Another thing to mention, which actually relates to the fifth publication criterion, which is about the English language in the paper. I would encourage you to approach assessment of language in papers quite carefully, thinking about the extent to which any issues that there might be with the state of the language in the manuscript at submission, whether those might be able to be addressed during the course of revisions. We don't want to be rejecting papers where the language isn't perfect at initial submission, if we feel that can be addressed during the revision process. And very often a round of thorough copy editing of the manuscript can iron out those issues and bring the level of the quality of the language to an acceptable level by the time a manuscript is ready for publication from a scientific point of view. Obviously, if there are such substantial issues with the language that you aren't able to engage with the underlying science, then that's something that either needs to be addressed very early on, perhaps by issuing a major revision immediately before peer review, or potentially rejecting it outright at the beginning. But we would encourage you to be open-minded when it comes to language, and trying to see if there is a way through the revision process. Okay. So I also wanted to mention that staff editors such as myself may also want to highlight or draw attention to particular aspects of a manuscript when we invite you to handle it. So please be on the lookout for any notes that we may have left to you when you do agree to handle a manuscript. It could be that we have concerns or questions that we want to put to you and for you to have in mind when you're carrying out your initial assessment of the manuscript. And once you've been through this process of applying your expertise and an initial scan through the journal's publication criteria and how they apply to this submission, you'll be in a position to decide whether or not you're going to send that manuscript out for peer review, or if you're going to reject without review. So I just wanted to run through some of the reasons why you might go for that latter option of rejecting without review, which is certainly within your prerogative as an academic editor to go for that option. So some examples of the sorts of situations where you might choose to do that would be where you can spot some really serious scientific flaws in the manuscript which just can't be addressed through revision. There's something fundamentally wrong in the study design or the way that the research question is being framed, which preclude further consideration. That's one possibility. It could be that the conclusions that the authors have drawn are just not at all supported by the data, perhaps because the sample sizes that are being used are totally inappropriate, something along those lines. It could be in relation to the first point that there's some kind of flaw in the question itself which is being asked, or some other aspect of the study which will prevent reviewers from being able to engage with it, and therefore there's no point in sending it out for review. While we do consider replication studies submitted to PLOS Climate, we need that to be clearly justified in relation to the existing literature. And so work which is completely redundant with existing published work, and where the authors haven't provided a justification for replicating that, or even framed it as a replication study, we shouldn't be considering that. And so that is another instance where you might reject before review. And finally, if there are problems with the manuscript such that the authors would not be able to bring the manuscript up to standard within a reasonable time frame, so for instance, if they would have to go away and redo lots of experiments, so many that it's actually going to take them many months or more to complete that work, beyond the kind of standard 45-day window for a major revision deadline, then that would be another option, another instance in which we would suggest considering rejecting without review. Okay, so that's a sort of quick run through of the initial steps that you're going to be taking when you're evaluating a submission that you've taken on. And if we flick back to the presentation now, I will talk through what happens if you do decide to go to the next stage, which is to begin looking for reviewers to comment on the manuscript. So we all know that these days finding reviewers is increasingly challenging. We recognise that here as PLOS staff members, and we are available to provide support with that if needed. But I wanted to run through some of the sort of strategies that you might adopt in looking for reviewers and hopefully securing those to comment on manuscripts that you're handling. And I will use another of these resources that we have available for you about finding and securing reviewers. And really the points that I'm going to kind of address here are the sorts of things that you should be looking for in suitable reviewers, and the sorts of strategies that you can use to try to find them in the kind of most manageable time frame possible, and have the highest success rate. So in terms of the sorts of characteristics that you should be looking for in a suitable reviewer, obviously it's going to be someone who has the relevant expertise. That could be in the subject area of the manuscript, but also in any special methods that the authors are using. And you might need to find a balance of reviewers who can comment both on the subject area, but also, for instance, if qualitative methods are being used in the study design, you might need to find someone who has specific expertise in those qualitative methods, in addition to somebody who can comment on the broader context of the subject area. We also would encourage you to think about the kind of career stage of the reviewer. If you're constantly sending out invitations to people who are at this sort of senior professorial level and are likely to be very, very busy people, the sort of hit rate, if you like, with your reviewer invitations is potentially going to be a bit lower. But equally, inviting people who are, I don't know, PhD students or even more junior is probably not going to be appropriate, just because their level of expertise is not going to be as deep. So looking at that sort of middle range of people who are at postdoctoral level above, early career researchers who are often looking to engage more with the review process and gain experience as reviewers, could be a good place to start with your search. One thing to really keep at the forefront of your mind when you are looking for reviewers is to think about whether or not the candidate that you're looking at as a reviewer could have any real or perceived conflicts of interest. Obviously, this is something that you will have taken into account when you decided to handle the manuscript, whether you yourself have a conflict of interest, but it's also, of course, something that applies to reviewers. And so we strongly encourage you to apply your best judgment to whether or not there could be any perceived conflicts of interest with a reviewer that you're considering inviting, because we really want to make sure that we're kind of covering ourselves and making sure that there aren't going to be any issues down the line with reviewers that we've invited to comment on manuscripts. Okay, I'm going to move along. In terms of the difficulties that can be faced in securing reviewers, as I say, this is something that's increasingly challenging across the world of publishing, and we recognise that. But there are some sort of tips available from experienced PLOS editorial board members, which include things like looking for researchers that you know and you're familiar with. Having that kind of personal connection can actually usually be very useful in kind of converting invitations through to acceptances. People whose work you're familiar with is going to be a good place to kind of start in terms of searching for people. But then you can, if necessary, broaden your search using all of the sort of databases that you'll be familiar with in terms of PubMed and Google Scholar and that sort of thing. We do have a PLOS database of reviewers which you can dip into if needed. It's not something that we actively maintain, but it does contain a pretty large pool of people that you can search through to try to find contacts if needed. And I've already touched on some of the sorts of things that are listed in these additional tips here in terms of perhaps looking for early career researchers who have more time and keenness to take on reviewer assignments. But you'll find in this resource document a number of other ideas about the sorts of things that you might want to take into account when searching for reviewers. So that's a sort of brief introduction to that side of the process. And now, assuming that you're successful in securing some reviewers and their comments come in, the next stage that we need to think about is assessing those reviews and reaching an editorial decision. So the reviewers' comments are going to come through in a structured form that we supply to the reviewers. And that includes some fields where they'll be commenting on things like whether the statistical analyses have been performed appropriately, whether the scientific rigor of the manuscript is appropriate. And then there's, of course, also free text fields where they can provide more detailed comments on their overall assessment of the manuscript and any kind of issues that they feel need to be addressed through revision. So it's all probably what you're familiar with through experiences with other journals. One thing to bear in mind is that there's always the potential for discrepancies in reviewers' recommendations, and that's probably one of those scenarios that editors dread how to handle those sorts of split reviews where one reviewer is saying this needs to be rejected immediately, and another reviewer is much more positive. So coming to a decision in that sort of scenario can be a challenge. I'm going to switch over to our assessing reviews and making decisions document here. We've got lots of information available in this document about how to approach those sorts of situations. One thing that I've already touched on that's really important here is that we, as a journal, want to empower you as the academic editor to come to your own independent judgment in these sorts of situations. So we encourage you to kind of take the reins in this situation and to come to your expert decision about what's going to be the most appropriate outcome based on the information that you have available from the reviewers' comments and from your own assessment. You want to kind of approach it in as balanced a way as possible. If necessary, if you're in that situation where you have, for instance, one reviewer recommending reject and another saying minor revision or even accept, and you're really unsure about the best way forwards, do always bear in mind that it is possible to invite an additional reviewer, a third reviewer, who may be able to kind of help you see a middle way through. And another thing that's potentially worth considering is inviting another a section editor or another member of the editorial board to provide a consultation on how to handle that particular case if you do get really stuck. But they can be tricky things to deal with, so we encourage you to kind of be patient and thoughtful in how you handle them. Now, in terms of the options that are available to you as an editor, of course, we have the kind of normal set of decisions listed here in this nice table in terms of major revision, minor revision, accept and reject. And this table is intended to provide you with a bit of a guide as to when you might choose one of these options. So I'm just going to quickly run through these, just kind of for context on why we would suggest plumping for one or other of these options in different scenarios. So really, with major revisions, which are a very common type of decision, this is what we would recommend that you go with if you feel that the manuscript has strong potential, but there are issues that really need to be addressed, perhaps in terms of the degree of detail in the methodological reporting in the manuscript, or if the authors need to provide more discussion of a particular aspect of their study design, or to nuance their interpretation of the data in some substantive way. And this would enable the authors to have 45 days as a standard to revise and resubmit their revised manuscript. So this is a very common option, as I say, as an outcome for the initial submission. Minor revisions are reserved for, as the name suggests, relatively minor adjustments to the manuscript to bring it into complete compliance with the publication criteria. I would encourage you to opt for the minor revision decision, even if the revisions that need to be made are very, very small. And that's just because if you do issue an accept decision that mentions some changes that you want to be made to the manuscript, it's very difficult for us to check that those changes do get incorporated post editorial accept. So please always go for minor revision if you really do want to see something happen to that manuscript before it gets published, because we can't necessarily guarantee that will happen if you issue an acceptance. So as I say, reserve the accept decision for when you are satisfied that the manuscript really does meet all of the journal's publication criteria. And I should mention that we do require, before editorial acceptance, that at least one external reviewer has had the opportunity to comment on that manuscript. So you're free to reject manuscripts without external review, but we do require at least one review before acceptance, and that's just to ensure that there has been an adequate sort of number of eyes on that paper before we've kind of signed it off as meeting the journal's requirements and that it's okay to go to publication. And in terms of post-review rejection decisions, these would occur if you felt that based on the reviewer's comments and your own assessment, the manuscript really did not meet the journal's publication criteria, and it was not going to be possible for the authors to bring it into line with those criteria within a reasonable time frame or at all. I will just very briefly mention that if you do reject a manuscript, it's possible that the authors will appeal that decision, or over time will decide to resubmit that work as a new submission. And we have processes in place for handling both of those scenarios. We have kind of dedicated workflows for running manuscripts through the system in those situations. And staff will be on hand to kind of advise on how all of that works. So in the interest of time, I think I will move on to just mention something about decision letters. So decision letters, of course, are the communications that get relayed to the authors when you have reached one of these editorial decisions. And in terms of the sorts of things that you want to bear in mind when crafting your decision letter, clarity is really the key word here. So making it really crystal clear to the authors how it is you arrived at your decision, what are the things that you've taken into account in reaching that. It's really great practice if you can refer to specific journal publication criteria to kind of support the decision that you come to. And try to bear in mind whether or not the authors are going to be able to use your decision letter to help guide them towards a really nicely revised manuscript, assuming that you are recommending a revision. Are they going to be able to kind of read through your comments and the reviewer's comments and bring their manuscript to a point that you're going to be happy with when you see that revised manuscript? So the idea behind the decision letter is always to support the authors in being able to make the next step in their journey with their submission. When you issue that decision letter, when you register that decision letter in Editorial Manager, it will either go directly to the authors, or occasionally it will come through a staff editor like myself. We do a certain amount of sort of scanning of editorial decisions that are submitted, just to kind of make sure that there's everyone's operating at the same sort of on the same page or the same line, and to ensure consistency across the editorial board. So you may occasionally see that a decision that you've submitted is kind of taking a few days to go through the system. That's probably just because it's been one of these ones that's being relayed to me to kind of double check that everything looks consistent with our criteria. Don't be alarmed by that, it's kind of normal practice. Yeah, there's plenty more information available in all of these resource documents, kind of providing guidance on what to do in particular situations. And as I say, if ever you find yourself confused about the best way to approach a decision, or the best way to frame a decision letter, then please reach out to myself or to another member of journal staff, and we'll be able to provide support, or perhaps put you in touch with another member of the editorial board to kind of help you coach each other in the best ways of handling those sorts of tricky situations. Right, I think at this point, I will hand back to Dina to continue with the presentation.
Thank you, Jamie. I'm going to reshare my screen once more. Perfect. So all of those quick guides that you just saw are also available on our Resources for Editors webpage, which looks like this. So anytime that you see quick guide here, those are each and every single one of the guides that we just went through. So if you need to access them at any point along the peer review timeline, that's where to find them. Other helpful things on this page, as we mentioned, are the guide to Editorial Manager. This here is a link directly to the PLOS Climate Editorial Manager webpage. And another really interesting guide that I'd like to draw your attention to, if you do experience difficulties when you receive the reviewer feedback, if there's just a situation that you're not quite sure how to navigate, we have this interactive adjudicating decisions guide. It's available in PDF format, but it's also available in this interactive format, which is kind of like a troubleshooting guide if you've gone through let's say your internet service provider and your internet is out and they ask you what's happening and you click through various situations. That's kind of what this is here. So if you just click through next, and we have these bucket themes of issues that might be going on in the peer review. So let's say the language was poor and that the authors didn't adequately revise the manuscript for language. You click this on and we have guidance on what it is that we recommend, and then even some sample text that you might be able to use in your decision letter. So that's something else that you can find on the resources for editors page. Another really helpful resource, of course, is journal staff, as Jamie mentioned. So climate@plos.org is your kind of one-stop shop email for anything that has to do with manuscripts that you're dealing with. And this is a shared inbox and we all have access to it. And so your incoming email can be routed to the appropriate contact. So let's say, even if you forgot Jamie's email, you could write to climate@plos.org with a question specifically directed at Jamie, and that email will eventually get routed to him. The second email here is the shared contact for my team, the editorial board services team. So this is more to email if you're experiencing some kind of issue away from manuscripts, for example, or if you wanted to provide both positive and negative feedback. Let's say you aren't receiving any manuscript invitations and you would like to receive more, you could email us at this email address and say, I would like to receive more manuscript invitations, and we'll be able to leave a note in your profile or see what we might have in terms of incoming submissions that we could get to you. So those are the important contact. We welcome any and all feedback at any time. Let's go ahead and move on to the Q&A section. And I'm going to go ahead. Everyone has full control over their microphones. I'm going to leave this screen up just as a placeholder. If you would like to raise your hand, I can help facilitate this Q&A session here, or if you feel more comfortable, you can type it into the chat at this time as well. Or maybe we answered all of your questions. Okay, Ricardo.
Right, thanks. First, let me commend the journal on this webinar, because it is very useful for all of us, even those who have been members of editorial board in the past. Many journals, unfortunately, don't follow the same process that you guys have set up. So this is really fantastic. Thanks for that. So my question is on the so you provided that very useful timeline, and there are instances where we get the reviews back, and I'm currently sitting on an editorial board for a different journal, and we are allowed to make the decisions in the sense that we go through the author's response to reviewers. And then we can decide whether, okay, we believe based on our expertise that they have addressed comments. Therefore, we don't send the article again back for review. Is there any guidance that PLOS Climate has on these, whether we can make that decision, or should we essentially send the article again back for review? I suppose, if it is a major revisions, as a kind of a rule of thumb, perhaps we do send it back. But I was just wondering, or wanted to hear from the editorial staff on this point. Thank you.
Yeah, I can jump in on that. So as you suggested, I think if a major revision decision has been issued, and particularly if that decision has been based on particular comments that a reviewer who was very well placed to identify those issues with the manuscript, if that's the case, when the revised manuscript comes in, it's generally speaking probably best practice to invite that same reviewer to comment on the manuscript again. If that was just one of the reviewers and there was another reviewer who didn't pick up on those issues, or who was satisfied more generally with the manuscript, then you don't necessarily need to send it to both reviewers again. Could just be to the one who picked up on those things the first time round. But equally, this isn't a hard and fast policy. So if you do feel that you're able to make that call based on your own judgment, then we wouldn't necessarily require you to invite the reviewers again. So we again sort of empower you to decide what's the most appropriate course of action in that scenario. But I think generally speaking, with a response to a major revision, it's generally useful if the same reviewers do see the manuscript again.
And Carl, go ahead.
Yes, comment, if we're handling a manuscript, we find reviewers, we send it out for review, and reviews come back. And then as an editor, as we feel that there are certain comments that reviewers should have been made that were not made, and we feel should be relayed to the reviewer, to the authors. How do we handle that? If we send those comments as an editor, of course, they're going to perhaps respond in a different way, that they may not feel as free to disagree if some type of disagreement, if that's what they feel they need to do. So under what circumstance would the editor want to provide comments to the author that are, I'd say, more of a reviewer type of comment rather than an editor type of comment?
Carl, can I ask, would this, for example, be a situation where the reviewers didn't do a particularly thorough job, for example?
Well, it could be.
Okay.
It could be a situation where the reviewers just didn't see something that the editor sees. And I always wonder when I get reviews back, are in some cases, is the editor actually providing that review under the auspices of reviewer number 3, for example? It's just something I always wonder.
My understanding is that under those situations, I had a similar situation in a different journal, and in a situation like that where we were not happy with the quality of reviews or felt that they had missed a major issue, we actually requested a third review with a quick turnaround to provide an external opinion. Jamie, I'd be interested to know the answer. I know as editors we have to be cautious about providing our own review impressions.
Yeah, so a couple of things here. So first, if you do have serious concerns that a reviewer hasn't adequately engaged with the scientific contents of the manuscript that they have agreed to review, then probably the first sort of port of call in that situation would be to search for another reviewer who can kind of do that job. It's unfortunate if it has to be done twice, by a second time by another person, but that's generally good practice. If you do pick up on things as an editor that you feel you yourself are perhaps you may be the only person in the research community who has the kind of requisite expertise to be able to provide reviewer level comments on that manuscript. It is possible for you to effectively act as a reviewer on that manuscript, provided there is transparency around that. So you can't anonymously review the manuscript in your capacity as academic editor. You would have to declare that these reviewers' comments were actually written by the editor. There is, for more kind of general comments around the manuscript, or if you pick up on a couple of relatively minor things that the reviewers haven't spotted that you do feel need to be addressed, there is space in your decision letter. There is a field entitled editor comments to author, where you're free to add relatively minor things there. Again, if you'd spotted a fundamental flaw in a paper that the reviewers somehow hadn't seen, then that might be another kettle of fish where you would probably want to go to a third reviewer. But for smaller things, there is certainly scope for you to include specific requests from you as the editor in your decision letter. I hope that we've kind of addressed the various aspects of the question there.
Okay, thank you.
Malcolm, go ahead.
Sorry, did you call on me?
Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, okay. Thanks. Like Ricardo, I would just say the overview today has been really helpful, so I appreciate that. I have a couple questions about sort of specific aspects of this. So I was kind of struck by the proposed timeline for reviews, because this maybe varies a lot from field to field, but in the social sciences fields that I'm familiar with, 21 days for peer review is quite short, actually. So I'm a little concerned that when I approach reviewers in the fields that I know, they may be a little bit taken aback and may, throw it back on me and more or less say, you can have a review from me, but you can't get it that fast. So I guess I'm wondering, is there a particular way you can suggest that I explain to people in the kinds of fields where I'm likely to be soliciting reviewers, why, in a sense, they should agree to do this on what will probably seem to many of them quite a sort of rushed timescale.
I can probably give an initial answer, because I had exactly this question for Jamie a couple of weeks ago. And because I had some concerns about it also being in some ways a fairly short time frame. And I found the answer made a lot of sense to me, which is that, what we are hoping for is that quite a lot of early career researchers will submit manuscripts, obviously not to the exclusion of anything else, but that is a big, as we've indicated, that is a big priority. And of course, there's a balance, right? So I've been an editor on journals where there was a 14-day turnaround, which was extremely difficult. But also I've been on journals where there was a very long turnaround, and that put early career researchers in quite a difficult position. So when I've worked as an editor and had to request things on a 14-day turnaround, what I've tried to do is to explain, that we're trying to achieve a balance here between being reasonable towards reviewers, but also allowing, in particular, early career researchers submitting their manuscripts a fair go at getting the material out into the public domain, if, of course, that's the decision. I don't know, Jim, if you want to add to that, you say it much more eloquently than I do.
No, not at all. I think you've hit the nail on the head there. Obviously, the part of the mission of the journal and of PLOS as a publisher is to try to, accelerate the scientific process and the progress that comes from that. So I think incorporating that messaging in the invitations is important. And if you need to enter into a dialogue with somebody, that's certainly something you can refer to. I would also just briefly mention that if there is a particular reviewer that you feel is the one person that needs to comment on this manuscript, then there is always the option of extending the time frame if that's necessary. We have a default setting, but it can be tinkered with if needs be. Obviously, we would encourage you to stick to as close to that kind of optimistic timeline as possible, but there is scope to amend it if needed.
Okay, I think in the fields I know there'll be quite frequent tinkering in that case. The alternative is just to get a lot of denial, rejections from reviewers, because they may just say, well, yeah, every journal wants me to review and ideally would like me to do it quickly. So most people just have a queue. I think it's more important to get quality reviews than fast reviews, but I'll try to get them fast as well. My second question is about some of the ethics, research ethics expectations, because I have previously looked at the PLOS sort of documentation or its sort of requirements for research ethics information and sort of affirmations and so on. And I think, it really varies depending on the field, what's relevant in the realm of research ethics. And it also depends legally, what country someone is based in and or did data collection in. But I know in the fields I'm in, for example, there are a lot of researchers who find the ethics processes very much designed for fields other than the ones they're actually working in. So if you're doing a lot of public opinion stuff, for example, which is my area, I mean, the box ticking is atrocious. So I'm just wondering, how much discretion do we have editors to sort of say, okay, this research is clearly not raising any ethical concerns. You know, we can approve this kind of thing, or you know, I mean, obviously, if something is remotely unethical, we would raise that, but it's never really an issue in the kind of fields I'm in. And conversely, the problem is people are just totally bogged down by very bureaucratic processes that don't really relate to them. So, you know, do we have a measure of discretion in that area to just sort of say, there's clearly no problems here, go ahead?
So in terms of how we apply our ethical policies and standards on PLOS journals, there is a sort of a measure of input from the academic editor on what should have been required from the authors, but it's generally the way that works is that a staff editor might consult with you about the particular situation in question, because research ethics are one of the things that's incorporated in this submission scanning step in the peer review process that Dina highlighted in the diagram, one of the earlier slides. I myself, for instance, on PLOS Climate will be checking for compliance with the journal's ethical policies. If I spot something in a manuscript that looks like it may not be consistent with our expectations, I may ask you as the academic editor to comment on whether you feel the authors have met the standards in the field, whether they've complied with any kind of local regulations that we should be aware of, etc. If it's relatively low risk social science research, for instance, then we do have approaches in place, kind of standard approaches in place across PLOS journals for how to deal with those sorts of situations, and we can discuss that in more detail another time. We also, within PLOS internally, have a publication ethics team who can provide some input on some of these things, and we, in addition, have advisory boards who help to kind of shape the policies that we've adopted as journals, but who are also available to comment on a case-by-case basis if we're ever really unsure about whether or not a particular study kind of meets the threshold for what we would consider to be compliant with our policies. So generally speaking, I guess to really try to answer your question, it's probably not something that you need to consider in a huge amount of detail for each manuscript, because it is something that PLOS staff should be routinely checking. But the caveat to that is, if, as you said yourself, if you spot something in the manuscript that is concerning in terms of ethics, then that is definitely something that you should raise to journal staff, so that we can, if necessary, investigate further or issue a rejection on that basis, or whatever the outcome might be. So we want you to kind of be alert to ethical discrepancies or shortcomings, but in terms of where the bar lies, that's something which is kind of defined by PLOS wide policy, generally speaking, and that we kind of have our internal mechanisms in place for picking up on these things too. So but if you'd like to have a more detailed conversation about that at any point, then we'd be very happy to do that.
Great, thanks.
Just take two more questions. Venkata, you've had your hand up a while. Go ahead.
Yeah, thank you for providing all the details. I have a small question regarding the plagiarism. So is it a technical team is providing those plagiarism, the similarity index, or editor has to take care once the review is going to happen?
So that's another of the checks that we carry out internally. So as with many journals, we will run submissions through a plagiarism checker, and any issues that arise as a result of that check will be brought to the attention of a staff editor to take appropriate action. So it's not something that you need to check for routinely. But again, if you start reading a manuscript and you realize, oh, I've seen this somewhere else, then that's an opportunity for you to bring that to our attention if you think that we haven't spotted that already. So again, you can be alert to that potential, but it is something that the journal will be actively scanning for ourselves.
Yeah, you mean to say that I need to alert to the editorial team in that case?
In that case, yes. If you suspected that there was a plagiarism issue with a manuscript that the journal was not already aware of, then yes, please just send an email to PLOS Climate, and we will be able to investigate further.
That's fine. Thank you. And one more thing, in general, we used to have 2 reviews, right? 2 expertise reviews. So this PLOS Climate also, we can take only 2, or can we go for 3 or 4 also?
We would suggest that 2 is usually a good number to go for. If you feel that it's important, perhaps because of if for instance a manuscript was highly interdisciplinary and you needed to have people from a number of different backgrounds commenting on that manuscript, that could be a situation in which having 3 reviewers would be particularly beneficial. Or alternatively, if you had to split reviews, someone who was very positive and someone very negative, and you needed a third opinion to help you reach a decision, then that's another possibility. We probably wouldn't encourage going any higher than 3 reviewers, except in exceptional circumstances, because otherwise things can get very complicated and slow. But yeah, 2 is usually a good number to aim for. As I mentioned earlier, we have a minimum of 1 external reviewers for accept decisions. So do make sure you at least have 1, but preferably 2.
Thank you, Jamie. Thank you so much. Yeah.
Okay.
Ricardo?
Jimmy, can I ask one question, please?
Do you mind, Ricardo?
May I ask any question? Actually, I am Dr. Manish Kumar from India, and I am working in Indian Himalayan forest. So basically, I am a forest ecologist. My question is slightly different. Actually, when I got this webinar invitation, some point I got that you have mentioned that contacting a potential author for submitting their paper in this journal. Actually, this is a reputative journal, and I thought most of the good workers are available who are interested to submit their paper in this journal. But basically, in Indian context, some of the good workers has a financial constraints. So how I can help as an academic editor to him or them to support their publications or their paper for submission in the journal? How we can encourage them? Just I want to ask.
So I think your question really relates to the issue of financing publication and how we can encourage authors to submit and kind of familiarize them with the options that are available in terms of financial contributions that are needed to support publications. So I would strongly encourage, if you're in conversation with anybody who is interested in submitting work to PLOS Climate, first of all, I would make it clear to them that PLOS never wants the cost of publication to be a barrier to participating in publishing. So if for whatever reason they are not able to either participate via an institutional arrangement through our global equity model, or they can't afford the cost of an article processing charge, which is still available as an option for people who aren't part of these institutional deals. Then I would point them to the information that's available on our website regarding waivers and fee discounts, because we do still have a comprehensive program of waivers and discounts available to support participation. But the guiding principle by which we operate is that money should never be a barrier to publishing with us. So we will always be there to help find a way to getting that article submitted and published, regardless of the financial context involved. So please communicate that message to anybody who's interested in publishing work in PLOS Climate. And if they have any questions about the details of how publication fees or fee assistance works, then you are very welcome to put them in contact with the journal directly.
Okay, thank you.
We'll take just one last question from Ricardo. You have your hand up.
Thanks, Dina. Sorry for being the last one to ask a question. This is, and hopefully it's a straightforward answer. As academic editors, are we barred from publishing or being co-author in a submission? Or if, and I hope we aren't, do we need to flag this in advance with the editorial staff? Because as I have been part of other editorial boards where we do just kind of drop a message saying, look, someone will submit a paper. I am co-author in that paper. Therefore, please do not send it to me, or whatever the case is. I know the editorial manager system can help with that, with the flow of submissions. But I just wanted, perhaps for the interest of others here, what is the approach to us as academic editors submitting a paper with PLOS Climate? Thanks.
Yes, in terms of the policy, you are very welcome to submit your own work or co-authored work to the journal. There's absolutely no problem with that at all. And in terms of the logistics, as you mentioned, there are fields in the submission forms in Editorial Manager where you can declare that you are an active member of the journal's editorial board. So we would encourage you to fill that field out appropriately. You might also want to mention your involvement in the editorial board in your cover letter accompanying the submission. As to whether you need to proactively inform journal staff about submitting work, it's not required, but if you do email me or Emma or anyone at the journal to let us know in advance, then that just maximizes the likelihood that we'll pick up on that submission when it comes into the system and be able to kind of channel it appropriately. Yeah, please do let us know if you're going to submit work, but if you don't, it's not the end of the world.
And I suppose, Jamie, it's similar if your students submit work, even if you're not a co-author, just to make absolutely sure it doesn't come to you, even though you're
that's a really good
a co-author. But if it is your student, perhaps it's useful to have the student as contributing author indicate that in the submission.
Yeah, very good point. I think that's
great. Thanks, Emma. Very good point. Yeah, thanks.
Can I, sorry, Dina, before we finish, can I very quickly just address a question that came up in the chat, because I just realized there was one from Kat, which came in quite early on. So Kat was just asking whether we have any special issues planned for PLOS Climate. And just to very briefly answer that, not in the immediate future, because we're still working towards our launch issues. However, very likely sometime early next year, we will begin thinking about running calls for papers specifically for PLOS Climate, and potentially also running joint calls for papers with other PLOS journals where there's alignment in the scope of our journals to offer authors kind of a wider choice as to where their manuscript is going to go within the PLOS ecosystem. And the way that these work is that those papers, if accepted, will all get packaged up into a nice shiny what we call collection, which is our equivalent of a special issue hosted on the PLOS web pages, potentially with some kind of nice blog posts and editorial pieces around the research articles at the core of the collection. So yes, that's all to come in the future.
Thank you. Right, that kind of comes to the end of our pre-planned program. I just want to reiterate one last time that please do reach out to us at any time if you have further questions or need support or have any feedback along your entire academic editor journey. You have our email addresses listed here in this presentation. And in particular, also, if you're on social media, PLOS is pretty active on Twitter. I've put the Twitter handle there at PLOS Climate. So if you are there, engage with the journal, and this segues into the next piece about being a PLOS Climate Ambassador, as we are all collectively growing this brand new journal and introducing it to the world. So please help us do that on your various channels in your networks, on social media, et cetera, whatever your preferred platform is. And with that, I'm going to pass it off to Emma and Jamie if there's any other final closing messages before we stop the recording and go into the social portion of our time together.
Okay, well, maybe I'll speak first, and then if Jamie wants to say some goodbyes. I mean, Jamie and I both at the same time typed the blog for PLOS, the PLOS environmental journals, into the chat line. I hope that people will enjoy having a look at that, and that we share it. It's not only our blog, we share it with what I like to call our sister journals in the environmental journals, and I hope that people will find it interesting, but also will be inspired to think about some blog posts and some options to get some interesting material out there. We've already had some really interesting submissions. I'm very well aware as a full-time academic myself, how incredibly busy people are. And I know a lot of people here sit on multiple editorial boards and have a lot of demands on your time. So I just want to say what a privilege it is that you have accepted to work with us. And we're so happy to have you part of the team on this new journey, and we really, really look forward to working with you going forward. Jamie.
I can't add much to that. I'm also incredibly grateful for the contributions that you're already making to our new journal and our community. And I hope that in some of the communications that you've had from us so far, you've got a sense of the sort of positive and excitement that there is at our end as well. We're really thrilled with how everything's been going so far with the journal, and excited to work together to drive it in the direction that we want to see it go in. We think we have a fantastic mission as a journal, and we hope that you'll all be alongside us supporting that over the coming months and years. So thank you again, and really appreciate your time today.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.
So I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing here.